So I'm wondering, with a couple of the last two presentations, if there's a bit of an anthropomorphic problem in terms of the notion of what an agent needs to be, in that it's kind of like how we think about ourselves, like the fear of the notion of being copied, and that we're a monolithic idea, the idea of an agent that's a monolith, rather than the notion of agents, intelligent agents actually being a large agency, or many agencies, or many societies, and where you can have many different versions of yourself. There doesn't just need to be, just because I, say for instance, change myself or update this particular agent, that the previous versions of me don't exist. And, you know, in particular, if you think about the idea of like, so you have, say for instance, a set of agents, and they determine that they are able to, they've done a really good job of becoming sophisticated at doing something really good. Say for instance, doing some sort of financial problem, or, you know, or being a paramedic or whatever. And so we trust them now that this version is now okay. But maybe there's an old version that we don't trust as much. And so we don't let it into our particular societies and an operational environment or whatever. But anyway, I guess the general comment is it just seems like, you know, like even with animals, I mean, all of or many of our cells they're all dead and copied, you know, in a matter of weeks or months anyway. So even our internal stuff kind of is continually being copied and deleted. But anyway, I'm just wondering if a lot of these ideas have an anthropomorphic problem in that it's not thinking about things from a society.
So can you repeat this question?
Sure. Okay. So I think that the problem with both the idea of the, like in the one presentation, of like, say for instance, rewriting yourself, reprogramming yourself, and potentially the issues of, like, say for instance, you know, do you make an error or do you fall into some hole and you've created a disastrous version of yourself? That's kind of the first thing, where I interpret it as that as being potentially some of the implications. And then the second one about the idea of the notion of that copying and deleting is somehow a big deal, rather than almost the thing that's would be fundamentally different, I think, with artificial agents is that by their very nature they can be copied en masse, and in fact not just copied en masse, but that it's an agency of agents that creates intelligence. In other words, by its very nature, intelligence is a society of many agents, all working together. And in fact, we have many copies of them, and many versions of those copies, and old copies and new copies, and we know what those versions are, and it's not a big deal. Or maybe it's not a big deal, but it's just basically it's a different way of thinking about things. Does that make more sense?
When you say old copies and new copies, do you mean the snapshots of the agent at some point in time, for example, or?
Well, yeah, for example, it could be. Yes, it could be an exact copy. In fact, a very...
So, yeah, I think it does matter, because if there is an agent that predicts that it will be deleted, copied, deleted, and it doesn't like that, then you may be in trouble.
But what if it's basically, what if this is something that's just actually a worthwhile thing to do? So for example, let's say that we have agents that are very good have a particular type of, like, what about if you're thinking about things from the perspective that certain agents have specializations, and so
that's what not generally intelligent agents?
Pardon me?
Not generally intelligent agents?
Well, maybe they're also generally intelligent as well, but we have, but even with human beings, we have generally intelligent agents that are specialized, and we maybe, you know, we have, you know, 1 million accountants, but they're also somewhat generally intelligent.
Yeah. the question is whether that would pose a problem, or this problem is meaningful.
Is it a mismatch between the framework and how you use it? Kind of question. That's some of the
yeah, I think that it's just the paradigm. Like, okay, like, I mean, let's say that you have more than one intelligent agent in the universe, right? And they both have they may have different experiences. And through those experiences, they may have different capabilities, say, for example. But the thing about them, they can also be copied perfectly. Unlike, say, for instance, biological creatures that need to spawn, like something new.
I think that's a bit open and move on to the
So, I suppose my honest view on this is that identity is kind of nonsense and there's no correct answer, but I don't think that's a real question to ask, so instead I would just like to ask kind of the opinion of each of the panelists as what they would say in this teleportation problem and why.
What was your phrasing here? I think identity is kind of meaningless.
That was my phrasing, yes.
Yeah, I'll go with that one. But seriously, it seems to me like there's a sense in which when you wake up in the morning, you are kind of a different agent, and how you're always kind of being a little bit imperfectly copied. It also seems to me like the day that someone makes a teleporter, I will steal it and turn it into a cloning device, and then make as many copies of myself as I can until it becomes illegal. And if people are killing some of the copies, I'll be a little bit sad about that, but I mean I'll still be spawning them.
I would consider a copy of myself. Just I don't care, but I don't think I would care particularly about copy versus original. But I think apart from that, a second interesting point here to make is that I care a lot. I do care about myself, but I do care a lot also about other things in the world. And I think that if an agent cares much more about the rest of the world than about itself, then it doesn't have really a conflict of interest between two copies, and it would combine the interests of those two copies and just follow a single goal of making the world better.
Just as a comment, I would agree that the question about what is identity is a bit meaningless, except that it's still a question. There's some philosophical concept there that we can't really identify, but there's something interesting beneath it. So I'm not saying that it's important to solve the question of what identity is, but I think it's important to investigate if there can be some consequences that are different in some occasions or not.
Okay, I have a question for the Benja team. First of all, I didn't see really the practical significance of the procrastination paradox. It seems it's a bit of convoluted scenario, this button pressing thing. Is there any real world scenario in which this paradox would arise for self-referential, self-monitoring systems?
The real practical application here is the question, how can we make an agent that never goes wrong? And here we have something where in an admittedly contrived scenario it would go wrong. So what we want is something where we can ensure that in actual real-world scenarios it never goes wrong. Now, if we have a contrived scenario where it goes wrong, that's kind of bad news for the real world. So the end result, of the presentation was, if you do finite time horizons, if you do time discounting, then you can do things that avoid that problem. But so it isn't just that you aren't going to get something similar for problems with finite time horizons, because there are ways to do reasoning that always works with finite time horizons.
The thing is, I don't see this implication that you say that if it goes wrong in contrived scenarios, that it would also go wrong in certain real-world scenarios. I don't see this implication.
So recruiter framed it in a very different, nearly the same way, but different way. The idea is interesting is that if you work for 1 week, you get 1 week of vacancy. But if you work for 2 weeks, you get n weeks squared. So I hire you, and I give you this deal, and then you should work forever, which is verified by me, but maybe not by you. But that's the optimal thing to do. So if you have an infinite lifetime, obviously. But still, the thing is, if your definition of an agent doesn't work in some very simple scenarios, maybe people try the whatever, but it's a very simple scenario, then what are the chances that it goes wrong in very complex scenarios like the real life?
So since there are many questions in this session, perhaps the poster process can get to stick and get started, prepared, and get ready while we have some further discussion. The people who posted, but is that next? That's some more questions.
Okay, one more about identity. For all I know, in every lifetime, the universe makes a copy of me and kills the original, and maybe it even makes multiple copies and they spawn up some kind of multiverse. And this really disturbs me, of course, especially the killing of the original at every instance. And I wish that the universe would stop, but doing these things. But eventually, it might have something to do with the way I represent the world and not the fact itself, because empirically it doesn't make the slightest difference. So there might be some philosophical problems attached to the notion of identity, but I have a strong suspicion that these problems go away if we make some of the philosophers go away. Nothing remains besides the fact that there
if you make the philosophers go away.
For us to treat two objects as being identical exactly if and only if they share a biography. That is, if you have a cognitive representation of them being on the same world line, which apparently is a very useful thing to have in many circumstances to allow reasoning about things in the world, especially ourselves and other agents and objects and so on. So this notion of identity is useful in terms of reasoning about the world, and it's useful to, quite likely, that it's ingrained into our cognitive representation of the world at a very, very deep level. But my question is, do you think that that would also have to be the case for artificial agents or AIs, and especially with respect to the notion of being disturbed of ending your existence and being transferred in an identical copy? Do you think that's meaningful to assume that this propensity of being afraid to be teleported or copied and so on, which I think is obviously irrational for obvious reasons, because when you stop being identity realists, kind of disappears. Do you think we need this in AIs? Or it will happen in AIs?
I do think we need to understand what's going on, and apparently given the diversity of answers in this room, I think it's very important to understand what's going on. The thing is, if you ask an agent whether it would be happy to be destroyed or not, obviously it would say no. Then, if it would be happy to be destroyed, if there's a copy of itself that is made somewhere else in the world, then it depends on the definition of the agent.
This will have to be the last question, running over.
Okay, maybe there is a bit of overlap. I don't know if this one is working. Okay, so this identity thing, I've done some work on this thing, and basically in philosophy there is this stuff, the somatic identity, which means that you stick to your body, your soma, and that's what defines your identity. And the more accepted one is the psychological identity, which basically defines your identity through your history, meaning I'm identical with my past. So I was very surprised to hear that you defined identity with the future, because, for instance, let's say I'm copied into 100 different pieces, and then I'm going to go to 100 different planets, have different futures, and right, that is still going to be me, provided that they start with the same past.
Yes, but if you have the choice of either copying or not copying, what's important is the future, not the past.
Well, I think the dinner conversation is somewhat decided going to be about identity, but we have to quit this session now, so we have time for the people that will present their poster doing a 5-minute presentation.